Big ruling today from the New Hampshire Supreme Court in Contoocook Valley School District versus the state of New Hampshire.
The New England take.
So out of nhjournal.com, please be sure to check out the reporting. Damian Fisher wrote up on this. New Hampshire Supreme Court rules ed funding inadequate but won't order the state to pay. And this has been a contentious multi-decade education funding situation in New Hampshire if you've not been in the loop on it. I honestly am not the best resource for the historical context of this. There's a lot to it. I'll link this article in the description as well as the decision by the New Hampshire Supreme Court if you really want to nerd out and look into it. But the big deal is the New Hampshire Supreme Court has sided with Superior Court Justice Ruoff in stating that the state is inadequate in its funding of public education here in New Hampshire. And something that's important to know in the context of this is something that's part of the New Hampshire state constitution, that adequate funding from a public education standpoint needs to be provided. So this goes beyond our whole discussion, education freedom counts, school choice, vouchers, or anything like that. It's important to know that this is something, when it comes to public education, is something we can't just entirely do away with without changing the constitution of the state. And I don't think any Republican that wants to continue to stay in office really wants to screw around with that too much, honestly. It's the reason why we're screwing around with EFAs in the way we are is because of that fact. But New Hampshire Supreme Court ruled Tuesday that the legislature is underfunding education, but it won't force the state to pay more. The much anticipated ruling in the Conval education funding lawsuit finds that the court backing an increase of the per pupil adequacy grant to $7,300, while at the same time that the justices refuse to force the state to pay up. Here's my prediction on all this. This is going to go nowhere. This ain't changing nothing. So what's going to basically happen here is, because the court didn't really have an enforcement mechanism because they're the court, this is just going to continue to be the same situation as is. Only now Democrats are going to have much better ammo on hand in order to attack Republicans for continuing to just have state-level funds be not very big. And that's what it comes down to. Right now in New Hampshire, we have a percentage of the schools, I want to say it's like 9% according to the Education Funding Institute. Right now, a majority of the funding is coming from local property taxes, and that has tremendous impacts when you're talking about what's happening in Portsmouth versus what's happening in Colebrook. Obviously, there's a tremendous difference in the amount of people that are there and the amount of money they make, and the possibility of collecting funds from property taxes to cover school needs, which has skyrocketed in recent years. And this is from the governor's press conference on it. She wrote a statement on Supreme Court decision in school funding case, and her case is that, quote, the court reached the wrong decision today. The fact is, New Hampshire's top 10 in the country when it comes to funding our children's education. We're evaluating the ruling to determine the appropriate next steps. In the meantime, I'll continue working with the legislature to support our teachers and keep delivering a best-in-class education for every child in New Hampshire, end quote. And she does say in here that New Hampshire ranks in the top 10 in the country on per-pupil spending, with the current funding sitting at $23,579. The issue is, less than a quarter of that is coming from the state government when you're looking at the per pupil spending. But it's very complex because you're looking at grant funding. You're looking at what just passed with the HB 1 and 2 bills here that finally got the state budget on time in order to begin today, essentially, because July 1st is when the next budget cycle begins. There's a lot of stuff when it comes to special education, individual education programs, various other specific programs the Department of Education and various other state agencies fund. And yeah, it's $23,000, but a lot of that is coming from local property taxes, federal funding, and other things of that nature that brings money in. And she does also say in fiscal year 26-27 budget Governor Ayotte signed last week, the state invested more money for public education than ever before at $2.6 billion, which is a tremendous amount. And I mean, this once again comes down to the more systemic issue at hand, in my opinion, is per pupil is not the important number that matters. It's what exactly are we spending the money on. I've been harping on this. I have a whole series here on the channel when it comes to the cost of education and kind of breaking down some of the data from that and some of the players that are involved with it. Is per pupil doesn't really mean anything, because when you look at $23,000, you're considering that also includes people with students with huge special needs are taken into that average when it comes to it. They're saying a lot of this money is honestly coming down to individual education programs, school lunch programs, special education, various programs like that costs a lot more for a percentage of the students that goes far beyond what it honestly costs to educate just an individual student that doesn't require those programs. We should, in my opinion, we should figure out a way to take care of these students. Obviously, we shouldn't just say, whatever, but we need to honestly start looking into, and that's something I hope to do in the show here. If you have any tips on that, I would definitely want to start diving into individual education programs and special ed, because that's a tremendous impact on the local school jurisdictions that goes far beyond equity or anything of that nature. It goes to equity at the individual student level. Some school districts have situations where half their kids need some form of school special programs like that, and other schools are, it's 10% of the students need it. We can eat that cost, whatever. This is a huge issue when it comes to the equitable funding or equal funding. That's not equity, that's equality of funding across various students, because there's a huge difference between the two of those. So going back to the article here on nhjournal.com, the majority decision, authored by Associate Justice James Barrett, was accompanied by 2 dissenting opinions reflecting the fact that the debate involves fundamental legal rights, such as the separation of powers within the state's constitutional system. The ruling supports Superior Court Judge David Ruoff's decision that state spending on local K-12 education must be increased by more than $550 million. Conversely, the justices also found that enforcing Ruoff's decision by making the legislature actually pay that amount would violate the constitutional separation of powers. And that's the huge important part here when it comes to actually having anything happen. And so this is from Bassett. Quote, instead, Ruoff weighed separation of powers concerns along the history of school funding litigation, significance of the fundamental right to an adequate education, and the need for a judicial remedy, and determined that he should establish a conservative minimum threshold. That base adequate aid, quote, must exceed, end quote, $7,356.01. In crafting a conservative minimum threshold, Ruoff carefully avoided the usurpation of legislative or executive branch powers, Bassett wrote. And in this article also, and Andrew Volinsky, who I've invited to the show. I've been trying to get him on. If you're a fan of the show and you somehow are friendly with him, I think a lot of the circles that follow the show are not necessarily in familiar circles with Volinsky. I want to have him on because he's one of the big players when it came to the original Claremont decision and has been involved pushing this on with his latest book is The Last Bake Sale, where he talks about this whole situation when it comes to school funding and everything that comes along with the Claremont decision. AJ at NewEnglandTake.com. If you have a contact, or if Volinsky somehow you're listening to this, I really would love to have you on the program. There's a big issue when it comes to the nature of what schools and property taxes are looking like right now when it comes to the amount of money required. State Representative Glenn Cordelli of Tufton Borough, chair of the House Education Policy and Administration Committee, said the Supreme Court ruling does not mean the legislature will jump to hike school funding, despite the constitutional violation found in the justices. Quote, it was very interesting to see split injustices on the issues of the amount of the adequate education and the immediate payment of the lower court amount. It is also interesting the education funding was increased in the budget passed, as well as the statement of principles regarding the separation of powers and the legislative versus judicial roles, end quote. So here's the deal. Checks and balances. The New Hampshire state government works very similar to the federal government, where there is the separation of branches. We have our judicial branch, which is the courts. Top court in the state is the New Hampshire Supreme Court. We have the legislature with Congress, with the House of Representatives and the Senate. And then we have our executive branch with the governor and executive council. The court is able to rule on whether something's constitutional or not. They can make rulings and say, hey, you got to do this, you got to do that. But when it comes down to ultimately the making something happen, it comes down to the legislature and the executive branch. This is the exact same way it works in the federal government. So with that, even though they are saying do this, we're going to continue to have the situation going as far back as Claremont where we're not having a constitutionally appropriate amount of money going towards public schools in the state of New Hampshire. So with that, my prediction, this is going to continue to be exactly as is. Nothing is going to change on this. We're going to continue to have this situation where we're going to have the left trying to push a broad-based tax, where we're going to have, they really want income tax or something of that nature, or some tax that's been done away by the Republicans in office, and bring it back in order to fund what they desire for public education. And on the other side, the Republicans are going to say, yeah, we don't care. We think you're wrong. We think it's unethical. We think it shouldn't be handled this way. And school funding is one of the most hot-button issues here in the last several years in New Hampshire when it comes to what's going on in Concord. So is this going to change? Probably not. I think there's a very important point here that is often shot down by Democrats, but I really think this is accurate. Once again, Representative Cordelli, the legislature now deems it necessary to positively proclaim as the sole branch of government constitutionally competent to establish state policy and to raise and appropriate public funds to carry out such policy. The legislature shall make the final determination of what state's educational policies shall be and of the funding needed to carry out such policies. And finally on here, quote, I have been warning folks for a year that they should be careful for what they wish for. Because guess what? The more funding that comes from the state government, the more impact that they will have on local jurisdictions when it comes to all the silliness when it comes to alleged book banning or what direction the local schools go into when it comes to that nature. Democrats write it off saying they already have this huge impact or whatever. Who cares? As many people on the right are going, it's already too far. We got to start bringing it back. We got to stop letting some of these crazy school districts doing some of the stuff on one side when it comes to the superintendent's office. It's all just so much hypocrisy when it comes to all of it. I honestly don't even know where to begin when it comes to the pedagogy and everything of that nature because it's very complex, but ultimately we do need to consider as part of this, no matter what way we go, the amount of funding and the strings attached to funding are tremendously important, and be careful what happens if the political enemy ends up taking office, because that will change the balance. All right, NewEnglandTake.com. I'm setting up a brand new Substack. Please be sure to check that out and subscribe over there. NewEnglandTake.com should take you right over there. If it's not working yet, it'll hopefully be working in the next day or two. I'm in the process of getting that transition going. And thanks to the Granite Grok for posting our episodes every Saturday. And follow me on if you're on LinkedIn for some reason, terrible platform, X, Facebook, YouTube, every major podcast platform. And we'll talk to you soon.